After death, there is nothing. No afterlife, no heaven or hell. Absolutely nothing. This was Eric's belief since he was young, but that was before he would reunite with his lover, 10 years after her death. Eric was an artist that came from France. He had published several poetry books, played the guitar, had a beautiful voice, and ultimately, he was a painter with a unique style. At the age of 16, he left his father's home, which was always filled with tension, forever, and embarked on an adventurous life. He traveled to different countries, painted in the heart of nature, and made a living by selling his art. A perfect life for a 20-year-old boy, where enjoying the moment was his sole purpose. However, after a tragic incident in a remote village in Turkey in 2014, his life changed forever. Eric spent the rest of his life trying to erase any trace of it from his mind through the pills, alcohol, and drugs. But after 10 years following his entry into the mysterious house over the hill, the past he was afraid of the most came back to haunt him. 3 months before Sarah and her friends went to the house on the hill, when Eric was invited as a guest to that house, he was preparing for his latest exhibition with a creative idea in mind. He, who at the age of 30 believed more in death and nothingness than in life, intended to depict the perpetual presence of the shadow of death on life using invisible colors, visible only through a specific light called the black light. However, he never thought that there could be things more horrifying than death itself, opening their way into his life. Eric was reserved and had no interest in connecting with others, but at the insistence of his old friend Martin, who handled exhibition affairs, he attended the party. It wasn't a bad party. At the request of Martin, he recited some of his poems, played the guitar a bit, gained quite a bit of attention. When the bell-like sound of a clock without hands rang loudly, Eric realized that midnight had passed and decided to return home to start his new piece. He went down to the basement of his rented house, which he had turned into a painting studio, and as usual, before starting his major works, he consumed some drugs to capture the inspirations flowing from his trance-like subconscious. Little did he know that this time, images would appear in his paintings that he hadn't consciously created. It was 4:30 in the morning and the sky remained dark. A pain in his right shoulder compelled him to take a break from his work. The effects of substances had worn off, and he was curious to see the initial outcome of his work. He stepped back from the canvas. What initially caught his eye were several trees in a forest, with one larger tree dominating a significant portion of the right side of the canvas. He walked towards the blacklight projector and turned it on to reveal the invisible part of the painting. The basement immersed in blue light, and something happened that caused a cold sweat to form on his forehead, and everything became clear. With some distance from the trees, there was a simple yet intricately designed rustic cabin. It seemed alive and real. Eric stared at the cabin for a moment, his mind restless and troubled from within. He knew this place well. It was part of the past he had tried to forget for 10 years. Quickly, he turned off the projector and left the basement. The next day, reluctantly, he went down to the basement. Without looking at his new painting, he began working on one of the half-finished canvases. It was past midnight when a mysterious sound caught his attention again, an indistinct and wordless melody sung by a woman. The melody consisted of just 4 notes and repeated constantly. He stopped working. His gaze shifted to a radio playing soft music, different from the mysterious voice. However, when he turned off the radio, the female voice also stopped. He stretched his body and poured himself coffee from his small flask. As he was about to take a sip, the mysterious female voice repeated, causing Eric to freeze in place. This time, the radio was off and no sound came from outside the house. In the heavy silence, he tried to listen more carefully to locate the source of the sound. Shortly after, his gaze fixed on a spot. Unbelievably, the sound was coming from his new painting. Although he was hesitant to look at the painting and reminisce about the past, he couldn't ignore the sound he heard. He turned on the blue light and stared at the painting. He wasn't mistaken. The sound was coming from inside the cabin, but what caught his attention even more was a spot right behind the cabin's window. He couldn't remember seeing it the first night, but whatever it was, it made him sad to his soul as he realized it wasn't a stain but a resemblance. It resembled a girl standing behind the cabin's window, staring back at him, and Eric knew her well. He had seen that girl many times in a remote village in Turkey 10 years ago, where he wished he had never set foot in. Before he knew her name was Faria, he referred to her as the girl behind the window. Every day at sunset, Faria would sit by the window, gazing with her beautiful yet melancholic black eyes into the horizon. It was this look that made Eric fall in love with her, a love that caused him to forget the most important warning of his travel guide, Aras, to avoid women and girls from the village. He couldn't and didn't want to stir up the bitter past, so he came to himself and went towards the canvas, nervously erasing the image of the girl and the cabin, knowing that the substance abuse and reminiscing about the past in his mind were the reasons he heard a voice, a mistake he would discover a few days later. He gave himself a few days of rest, but the proximity of the exhibition and Martin's pressures pulled him back into the basement. This time, as soon as he opened the basement door, he realized its strange condition. He had forgotten to turn off the projector, and as a result, the basement was filled with blue light. However, what bothered Eric was the same female voice, now closer than before, filling the space. With slow and heavy steps, he went down the wooden basement stairs, and suddenly, fear engulfed his entire being. The image of the cabin had reappeared on the canvas, but that was not the only thing. Eric was sure the last time he saw the painting, the cabin's door was closed, but now it was open, and there was no sign of the girl behind the window, even though her singing could still be heard, this time from outside the cabin. With a sense of hesitation and uncertainty, he approached the canvas, captivated by one of the trees standing in front of the cabin. On the trunk of the first and largest tree, a delicate and feminine hand was visible. Unconsciously, he was thrown 10 years back to the forest where their romantic encounters happened amid the twilight. These clandestine meetings occurred each time the village men left, with Faria surprising him from behind the trees, except for their last meeting, when she never showed up. Lost in the past, a sudden movement behind the tree caught his attention. The hand gently withdrew, and from behind the tree, a glimpse of a dress and dark locks slowly unveiled a girl standing there, as if emerging from the shadows. With anger mingled with fear, he tore the projector off the wall and threw it toward the canvas. The once vibrant blue light dimmed, and the canvas fell to the ground. When Eric left the basement, he couldn't stand on his feet. He fell to his knees and began to cry. After a decade of suppressing the most painful memory of his life, it had resurfaced. Faria, bound by tradition to marry her cousin, had planned to escape with Eric, whom she had fallen in love with. That night, Eric waited for her, but she never came. Later that night, Aras informed him that Faria's male relatives had discovered their plan, urging him to escape alone. Tragically, Faria was murdered by her own family. Eric never found out what had actually happened to Faria, but the last moments of her life and the thought of what had transpired were something he could never come to terms with. He, previously dismissing the basement events as hallucinations from substance abuse, poured the remaining substances down the toilet. He then ripped the painting canvas apart and cast it out of the house, hoping to end his nightmare, unaware that the nightmare had just begun. A month after the party at the Hilltop House and a few days before the exhibition, Eric was not in good spirits. Due to the events of the previous nights, He refused to use any substances for a few days, and this had taken a toll on him both physically and mentally. However, he preferred to endure the pain rather than confront his bitter past. It was a stormy night, and the sound of the wind howling through the window frames was scary. Like a couple of nights before, he took some strong painkillers, curling his legs up to his chest and covering his ears with his hands to block out the wind noise. He lied down on his bed and went to sleep, but a few hours later, a sound woke him from his slumber. At 4:30 in the morning, Eric awoke with a sense of fear. Though the wind still howling outside, it wasn't what had awakened him. Rather, it was a noise coming from the basement. The stairs leading down were as worn as the ancient house itself, yet they never creaked without cause. He remained in place, listened carefully. The distinct sound of footsteps placing gently on the stairs reached him. Someone was coming up from the basement. The basement door, situated in the middle of the lengthy hallway, linked the hall to 2 bedrooms at the house's far end. Opening the door and flicking on the light, he found no one on the stairs. Wanting to be certain, he went down into the basement for a quick check. Everything appeared normal, so he returned to his bed. Sleep eluded him, and in the room's darkness, he lit a cigarette. Leaning against his pillow, he listened to a late-night message from Martin, an unusual occurrence. Martin's voice was filled with anxiety and fear, describing unexplained and unsettling events at his home and workplace in recent days. Eric, intending to respond to Martin, suddenly heard something that caught his attention. Amidst the howling night wind, a familiar voice reached Eric's ears, a feminine voice that he heard before. With the power out, he used his phone's light to focus on the room's door, where the sound originated. No one was in sight, but he could still sense a presence. The voice intensified, and the old floor creaked, indicating that someone's approaching. Abruptly, all sounds ceased, plunging the room into an eerie silence. However, this silence didn't mean Eric was alone. Whatever it was, it now occupied the space beside him on the double bed, a presence that he recognized. Astonished and fearful, he stared at the empty spot next to him. Moments passed in this tense stillness until a sudden, terrified scream pierced the air. The bed violently shook, tossing Eric off and causing his head to collide with the nightstand. The strained groan that followed was the last thing Eric heard before slipping into unconsciousness. This nightly occurrence continued consistently between 4 and 5 in the morning, leaving Eric baffled without any plausible explanation. However, one thing was clear to him: the sound, reminiscent of Faria's cry, and the mysterious happenings were connected to the mysterious black light painting. In an effort to confront this haunting phenomenon, he brought the blue light projector into his room, preparing for what was to come. As the bedside clock signaled 4:30, Eric's anxiety heightened. Despite the terror anticipating him, he was determined to bring an end to this ongoing nightmare. The room filled with blue light, and Eric focused on the frame painting. Something happened. Faria's cry resonated in the space, and soon after, a hand emerged from the frame, just as it always did. Holding his breath, Eric witnessed the gradual revelation of Faria's long black hair from behind the wall. To his surprise, when he finally saw her beautiful face and her kind smile, a sense of relief washed over him. It was almost unbelievable. Faria appeared exactly as he had last seen her. Faria, composed and dignified, locked eyes with Eric as she approached the bed and took a seat. Tears welled up in Eric's eyes, and he couldn't look away. Time passed, but Eric gradually sensed a shift in Faria's demeanor. Her smile vanished, replaced by a profound sense of fear that consumed her being. Suddenly, she involuntarily collapsed onto the bed. Her arms spread open like a cross, as if an unseen force had affixed her to the mattress. Overwhelmed by terror, Eric instinctively rose from the bed, his eyes fixed on the unsettling scene before him. Farya's terrified gaze remained fixed on Eric as she let out a scream of horror, and in an instant a deep cut appeared on her throat. Blood covered her body and clothes, and her desperate gasps accompanied with a choked growl emanating from her severed throat, driving Eric to the brink of madness. He found himself pinned against the wall, screaming in anguish. It was then that he realized the haunting sound he had heard every night was the tormented cry of his beloved, a sound that was never meant to leave Eric's life. A few days later, when Martin's calls went unanswered, he decided to visit Eric's house. Breaking a window, he entered and was greeted by the overwhelming scent of gas that filled the room. Shockingly, he discovered Eric's lifeless body lying on the bed. Miraculously, Eric managed to survive death, but his recurring nightmares eventually led him to a mental hospital. At this point of the story, Eric fell into silence and lit a cigarette. Sam and Elias, who were present at Eric's house, couldn't help but wonder about the events that followed. However, Eric's response was perplexing and unbelievable. It had been approximately 3 months since Farya and his nightmares inexplicably vanished, abruptly ending everything. This revelation was difficult to comprehend. Eric had never seen any connection between his nightmares and the house itself, dismissing them as mere hallucinations fueled by substance abuse. Consequently, he had taken no specific actions, and no significant events had occurred during that time. So, how did both his and Martin's nightmares come to an end? Sam pondered on Eric's last words repeatedly, hoping to find a clue. Suddenly, he realized that Sarah had experienced the same nightmares exactly 3 months ago. Seeking further clarification, he inquired about the exact date from him. Eric vividly recalled the night because it coincided with the cancellation of his exhibition. Elias and Sam exchanged astonished glances upon hearing the date. It aligned perfectly with the night of Elias and his companion's party at the mysterious house. However, they struggled to discern any connection between the two events. Although no apparent answer presented itself, another thought captivated Eric's mind. Among the guests during that fateful party, there was a man named Mateo, who had previously visited the house. Eric remembered Mateo well, not only because he had organized the party, but also due to his peculiar behavior that exuded fear and anxiety. It had compelled him to leave the gathering earlier than planned. If the house on the hill marked the beginning of the nightmares, why did Mateo return there again?